sense. I say welcome again to Benedict Spence, back from World War II. World War III on the screen, on the horizon.
Yes, perhaps I'm not harking back to the past. Maybe I'm just looking forward and preparing for the inevitable life in a prisoner of war camp. I don't think that this is going to lead to nuclear war. Just got to be completely honest. It would be a massive overreaction to the deployment of these missiles. They are very good missiles. They can hit Russian infrastructure deep inside Russia, but it's not like they're intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it's not like Ukraine actually has nuclear capabilities of its own.
Well, they gave them up in return for a guarantee from Russia, US and Britain that they would be protected as an independent nation state. What happened to that?
Yeah, the only two countries that have ever given up nuclear weapons capacity are not in a great state, it must be said. Admittedly, nobody... South Africa, which just collapsed in on itself.
I'm really glad the South African government doesn't have nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, yeah, there is a very big reason that there are there's very little in terms of nuclear technology in Africa at all, and that is largely because much of the West and indeed the East goes, no, we don't trust these people. Because, you know...
The kleptocratic leaders.
Well, basically, yeah, even the good countries are at risk of collapse at any given moment.
Let's go back to Europe. Yeah. But I mean, look, should we be fair? Because I think there's a lot of saber rattling, and I think basically, here's my message, Vlad. I think you're a pussy. I really, really do. I simply do not think that. I know he's killed with his own cold hands. Of course he has. He's a murderous, tyrannical dictator.
What is it, KGB agent?
KGB agent. I don't think for a moment that he's brave enough to do so. I also don't think that he has enough military people who would back him. We saw what happened when there was that attempted coup by the Wagner Group. I mean, the army literally just stood aside and said, on you go, keep on moving to Moscow.
It's difficult because I don't think that Russia is in a great state of affairs. But I don't think Ukraine is actually in anywhere near as good a state of affairs as Russia is. I think that this is the big thing that isn't being discussed with Western publics enough, though it is beginning to filter through. You know, everybody was talking about the great big push, I think, last year and all that, and it came to nothing. They literally don't have the manpower. Partly that's because they were not given...
as well, because we keep dragging our feet.
But that's the point. They don't have the manpower because they were never given the weaponry at the time. So this war of attrition has meant that more and more Ukrainians are just dying, frankly, needlessly.
Although Russians are dying at a far higher rate. 1,600 a day killed or seriously wounded.
Has a much larger pool to draw on. They can do this. That's the reality, and this was always the danger, was a drawn-out war of attrition.
And
which
Vladimir
Russia will
Putin
win.
simply doesn't care how many Russian men he kills.
And he's re-augmented the entire economy. Actually, other countries like India and China, they don't care about Western sanctions. They're more than happy to sell and do business with Russia. The Russian economy is doing fine. That's the thing about Western sanctions is you need the entirety of the rest of the world to get on board.
Well, you know my views on the likes of India. You know, you want to be a Western ally. Pick a side and be clear about it.
Yeah. This isn't going to lead to nuclear war, though. As much as anything else, because of Russia's dependence on countries like India and China, they don't want the normalization of the use of nuclear weapons. What they also don't want is, let's be clear, if Russia were to actually use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, Ukraine would get nuclear weapons very quickly. It has the capacity to get them, and there are lots of countries that would be more than happy to sell that technology to them. It would lead to an escalation, though, in other countries around the world going, right, well, we're all going to get nuclear weapons now, and it doesn't matter if it's Japan or Saudi Arabia or Azerbaijan. Lots of these countries are actually trying to acquire them.
From what I can gather, not being an expert in this field, as in many fields, that is actually rather harder than people think.
It's harder than people think if you're trying to go about it the right way. That's the way to think about it.
You should have had a white cat, stroking a white cat on
I
your
should
lap.
have done, but then I'd be accused of being a spokesperson for the Russian government.
Yes, but there we are. Yeah.
But no, I mean, put it this way: there's an expression which is latent nuclear power. That is to say, has the capacity to get nuclear weapons within a matter of weeks, if not months. Japan is one of them. Iran is one of them. Saudi Arabia is one of them. There are lots of countries that fall into that category.
Israel's been making sure. Thank you very much, Israel, over the years, that Iran doesn't get too close to this point. Here's my thing on this: is that Vladimir Putin makes threats all the time. When he threatened to effectively invade Ukraine, people didn't take him seriously. On this, I think people are going to take him too seriously. I don't think that you can go through life and, as a Western leader and as Western populations and just say, well, you know, he's a murderous dictator, he's a threat, we just can't do anything to make him angry because he might do that. That is no way to live. That would have been us, frankly, not fighting Hitler.
Well,
that would have been us not trying to fight the exactly, to the 1930s.
Yeah.
That would have been us not taking on, you know, Russia in the style of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. That would mean us not taking on Vladimir Putin at all over Ukraine and not taking on Xi Jinping if and when he invades Taiwan. Question marks over that. I just think you need to say enough is enough. No, we'll go. You know, come along if you think you're hard enough. The reality is, Vladimir Putin cannot stand the full might of NATO forces, particularly American forces, if they choose to deploy them. If he goes nuclear, we're in a different territory. He's not that stupid, and there aren't enough people around him who are that stupid to allow it to happen.
But I would say, and to mention 1930s, Hitler, the Sudetenland, all of that, that is what happened before, and this is comparable, what's happened in Ukraine with the initial annexation of Crimea. And the problem is, and this is going to sound, you might find this slightly odd for me to say, this is a failure of the European Union not actually becoming even more integrated and becoming the superstate it wants to be, because it can't actually have a joined-up foreign policy if it doesn't do that. You have all of these different countries pulling in different directions. And if you have the most powerful one, Germany, saying to the other ones that want a stronger stance against Russia, Poland, the Baltics, for instance, if you have them saying, no, you can't do that because we need their oil, it doesn't work. You need to be the superstate, or you need to just follow your own policy. And NATO is supposed to overcome that, but of course the United States, very irritated that European countries don't pay their way.
Yeah,
so it's all fractured.
I'm certainly with America on that, absolutely. Well, look, let's turn our attention to stuff closer to home, but I do want to hear from you on anything we're talking about, of course, today, but particularly, do you fear the war in Ukraine escalating? Do you fear that we could turn into nuclear war? These saber-rattling threats from Russia, do you think we should believe them? And what actions do you think we should take or not take? I'd love to hear your thoughts. 0344 499 1000. You know all the other ways of getting in touch. Let's talk about farmers. Big row escalating over farmers' protest yesterday in Westminster. Saw lots of the guys on the train when I was on the way home as it had finished. They made their voices heard all over the telly and the radio yesterday. But the government said they're not backing down. Keir Starmer has laughably said, my first job was on a farm. That was while his father was running the toolmaker factory.
Yeah.
And
is there anything he hasn't done?
I know, and Rachel Reeves was not working as an economist.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt at all that the Labour MPs from rural areas, and there are now a lot of those as a result of that massive majority in July, they are getting very, very worried. This was sprung on them. Apparently the Department of Environment didn't even know about this until the day before the budget, and having already promised this wouldn't happen, and the Prime Minister promising they wouldn't do this. We saw Jeremy Clarkson, who's a great communicator, being a bit of his usual stroppy self, to be fair. A bit grumpy Jeremy came out yesterday.
He has just had a heart attack.
Fair enough, I get that, fair enough. I did some TV shows with him. He's quite grumpy. I love him. I think he's the most brilliant writer and broadcaster, but he's a bit of a grumpy old sod. He would freely admit this, I'm sure. But him having a little bit of a fracas with the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire. And again, depending on whose side you're on, people seem to say, well, he won that one. She says, oh, you typical BBC. And she was saying, but it's not affecting many farmers. You're worried about rich people got £1 million farms. And like. But I have to say, I thought she actually did quite a good job of questioning him, and he didn't have a lot of the figures, which he should have. If he supported the cause, he should have to. And it always annoys me when celebrities, and I know he does know them, he should use them. But Keir Starmer says, well, the BBC backs the government on their figures about how many farms are being used, but the BBC Verify, who did this, they had to do a correction because they didn't know the difference between a hectare and an acre. Yeah,
BBC Verify is a joke. It is a very well-known online meme that it is a joke and that everything can be explained by radicalised far-right young men.
Always.
That's always its excuse to everything. When it comes to Victoria Derbyshire, you're right, actually, she gave him a bit of a filleting. But the problem is, actually, what she was saying to him, oh, you only bought your farm to get out of paying inheritance tax.
But only because he had said that himself.
Which he did.
Interview.
It wasn't exactly a ha-ha, gotcha kind of thing, because everybody already knows that he said this. All the farmers, who you'd imagine would be the people most irritated by that, they know it, and they are still on board with him being a major figure in their campaign because he is such a good broadcaster. They know which is the important thing.
But as he has said, he's not worried about himself. That's not all his money.
And this is the funny thing. Watching Steve Reed and Labour trying to spin this, in the after, they're trying to turn around and go, oh, well, what actually this is going to do, it's not about raising money. Actually, it's about letting younger farmers buy property so that they can start their own farms. And you kind of think, why didn't you lead with that if that's what this is actually about? And also, it's not true. Everybody also understands that those small farms that you're talking about, young farmers, are even less profitable than the mid-sized ones. But the only people that have the money to buy the plots of land that are going to be sold off are the super rich people and corporations doing it to avoid inheritance tax. They'll find other uses for it. And that's what I don't understand about all of this. They're trying to spin it as some sort of great egalitarian, we're giving it back to the people. It's not. It's a cash grab, and it's not going to go down very well.
And also, again, it's either worth doing because you get enough money, in which case it affects a lot of farms, or it's not worth doing because you don't get much money because it doesn't affect a lot of farms. Which is it? And this is where we get into the same thing with the winter fuel payments. That's also in the news, because the cuts to winter fuel payments, basically to anyone who's not just claiming a pension credit, will push up to 100,000 pensioners into poverty. And that's something that ministers have had to admit. At least 50,000 older people will be in poverty at any time, but it could be up to 100,000. Now, I mean, these figures, but then again, that was the policy that was sold as well. You know, it won't affect the poorest pensioners because they're already on pension credit. And then they had to admit there were, you know, was it 100,000, couple 100,000 pensioners who weren't on claiming pension credit, who were entitled to it, who are not claiming it. And now they say, well, it's gone up, the number of people claiming it. But that's, it's, you know, who every week. But that's still not enough to account for all the people who do need it and are generally going to sit on a day like today when it's sodding freezing without their heating on because they're worried about it. But this is the same thing. Everything they announce saying, oh, it won't affect many people, but we desperately need the tax in from this, the money we're saving. And you just think, it does. The numbers don't add up.
No, they don't. And it's pennies that they're talking about saving. And when they talk about the ever-expanding black hole, and you think, how on earth is this, which is going to push, as you say, people into fuel poverty or farmers out of business? How can this be justified, especially when you're also giving massive pay rises to certain public sectors, and it looks like those are going to continue for the foreseeable future? That, you know, the adults that are back in charge are actually really not very good at this, either either the sums or the optics of this. But just to go back very quickly to the BBC, something that I've noticed about this, and that is the sort of the emphasis, the burden of proof. It used to be that the state broadcaster and other broadcasters, media outlets, would go to the government and say, how can you back up your figures? That's not happening this time. They're going to the farmers, they're going to the pensioners, they're going to the unions and saying, oh, you're saying it's all this, but the government say it's this. And you notice a real change in the balance. It always used to be, when it was the Tories, justifiably, they would go for the jugular, they would say, your figures don't add up. Now it's the other way around. It's BBC Verify running ops for the government and saying, oh, but the government say this, and it all checks out. And you're thinking, since when did that become journalistic best practice?
It's just extraordinary.
It's either ideological or it's lazy.
The official figures say, but also, given that the person who basically is in charge of BBC Verify lied on her own CV, she's probably not good. She'll
be the Chancellor before you know it.
She'll be the Chancellor. I mean, she's obviously not bothered about people telling her little porky pies, is she? I mean, again, the idea that anybody in that role, you think they'd let any of the Tories go for that? You think they'd let people like me get away with that?
No, absolutely not.
Give me a break.
Absolutely
Give
not.
me a break. I just want to talk about one other story before we go to a break. The Democrats. This just blows my mind. If you want to have an idea of just how utterly mad American politics is, a new poll of Democrat voters has revealed that Kamala Harris, I don't know. I still don't know. I neither know nor care how to pronounce her name.
It's the way that you have to put your head back to pronounce it.
This week, however she's pronouncing it this week, Kamala Harris is the top choice of Democrat voters to be the party's nominee in the 2028 presidential election. 41% of likely Dem voters reported they thought that she should run again. The next one down, I kid you not, was Gavin Newsom. Again, he's an appalling human being. California governor won 8%. Josh Shapiro, I think Wisconsin, he got only 7%, and along with Peter Buttigieg. But it's just, how do they not get? And they're all saying this person, well, who they blame for the election result for Donald Trump winning? Well, you know, this or that, media coverage, online this. One of the main things they think was that because, you know, Joe Biden stood down so late, they didn't get much time. She only had a few months. Her poll ratings went down the more people saw of her. She had a chance of winning if they'd had the election the next day before anyone heard her speak and realised that she's utterly vacuous and a fool.
It was a fantasy. There was this idea that they were pushing that, you know, she was running a good campaign, and anybody with two eyes could see that she was not running a good campaign. Just having Beyonce appear at a rally does not make a good campaign. But we already knew this, that a lot of Democrat activists and voters do live in a separate fantasy world, and the rest of the American population is diverting away from
and
it.
I know he is not vacuous, but he's also a rubbisher. The amount of people I know who vote Labour, lifelong Labour voters, who will say, oh, Keir Starmer, he was the great white hope. Now, again, I think a lot of us were surprised when he was able to turn around what happened, you know, in 2020 all the way to that massive victory in July this year. But they're like, he's going to be so good, he's going to be so good. Well, how's that working out for you guys?
To be fair, lots of Conservatives said the same thing about Boris Johnson. A lot of Tory members said the same thing about Liz Truss. Everybody has their blind spots.
Boris Johnson, hey, he was the better of two. I always go for, you know, the better of two options.
It's true.
But Boris Johnson, I thought, did a pretty good job until early March 2020. He was doing a great job. By May 2020, I had issues, and they continued. Anyway.